So I just got back from seeing Eddington, and I had some thoughts. So my immediate gut reaction is that, unlike Ari Aster's previous movies, this is not a horror movie. I didn't really know what to expect going in, because I had mostly avoided the marketing materials. I had avoided reading any reviews because I am a pretty big fan of Aster's previous writing and directing efforts, and I very much so enjoyed seeing Beau is Afraid in theaters. I did not see his first two pictures in theaters, but I did see Beau is Afraid, really enjoyed it, had a great time. And this one, I have been looking forward to for a while, just by virtue of it coming from the creative team that it is coming from, but I don't really know how I feel about it, which is, I guess, why I'm filming this video. This is just going to be a sort of quick, off-the-cuff, me sort of talking myself through my emotional and intellectual experience watching this movie, because I don't know if I liked it or not. If I can say, yeah, I liked this movie, in the way I can very confidently say with all of Aster's previous films. But something about it affected me to the point where I said, okay, this is the thing that is actually going to provoke me to film a YouTube video for the first time in over a year, after saying that's a thing I'm going to do over and over and over again and not doing it. And so, I guess, in filming this video, I'm hoping to sort of investigate my reaction to the film, both as an audience member, but also as a writer myself, because that's how I tend to approach most narratives that I engage with, is from that perspective of construction and picking it apart. And so, I really want to talk about my thoughts on Eddington as a narrative, as Aster, as the presenter and facilitator of that narrative, and on what a movie like this really says at a time like the time it is coming out. And so I guess I want to start with my most immediate pressing thought upon watching this movie. And this hit me about halfway through the film, and it stuck with me for the rest of it. Which is, people say all the time, oh, they could never make Blazing Saddles today. Eddington, from my perspective, is Ari Aster, director and writer of Midsommar, Hereditary, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, Beau is Afraid, saying, well, I'm going to make Blazing Saddles today. And that, in my mind, really is what this movie was. I would hesitate to call it a comedy, but I would absolutely call it a satire. And I think that, when people say, oh, we couldn't make Blazing Saddles today, the assumption is, oh, well, people are soft, people are easily offended, and so offensive material can't land the same way it did when Mel Brooks made Blazing Saddles. But I think the truth is, in that statement, well, you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today, it's more like, well, should you make Blazing Saddles today? Because the fact of the matter is that the issues that Blazing Saddles was commenting on 50 years ago have become hyper-accelerated in our current discourses. And in my mind, this is really a film that is Aster's attempt as a member of that dominant class, an assimilated European diaspora middle-class white man from, by all accounts, according to his testimonies, a fairly well-adjusted background. And I think this movie was really, it came through as a writer and creator who was really trying to reckon with their place in that dominant narrative and that narrative of dominance, and doing that through this sort of Western satire that sort of does with all of these classic Western tropes placed against the backdrop of the COVID pandemic and social media and these very contemporary culture war issues. It kind of raises the idea that, well, if you were to make Blazing Saddles today, it really wouldn't be all that funny at all, because those issues, like I said, they've become accelerated, and those systems haven't gone away. They've just become hyper-militarized. They've become hyper industrialized. And this was a comedy in the sense that it was a comedy of errors. But I laughed maybe 4 or 5 times during the whole movie, and they were deeply uncomfortable laughs every time it happened. And I think it was impossible for me to watch this movie without thinking about the fact that me and one of my partners recently read together. We read through Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night, which is a novel about a man, Howard W. Campbell Jr., who was a spy for the American government undercover with the Nazi regime in World War II. So he portrayed as a propagandist, an American expat who played this cowboy role, and the story is told through his confessional diary as he's being put on trial as a war criminal for his role in the Nazi regime. And because it's being told from his perspective, it's sort of a Humbert situation where you have a character who is drawing you into their world, but at the same time, you have to remember you're talking to a fascist. And this movie opens with an hour of sympathy for the devil. Joaquin Phoenix's character, the sheriff of the small town of Eddington, which is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in May 2020, is a scumbag from the beginning. But you also get into his head and you get under his skin, and the camera follows him for just long enough that you might start to think that this is a man who has layers and is complicated, and beneath all of that raw power that belongs to him as sheriff, that he is willing to exercise against his community through his position as sheriff. The narrative shifts very abruptly, and it makes you as a viewer, or at least made me as a viewer, really reckon with, oh, right, this person I'm watching in this story is a fucking monster. And that was really interesting, comparing this film to all of Aster's previous films, which are very much so stories about victimization. In the case of Hereditary, it's the Graham family's victimization at the hands of the payment cults. In Midsommar, it's Danny and Christian and their study group's victimization at the hands of the Harga cults. In Beau is Afraid, it's Beau's victimization at the hands of his mother and at the hands of capitalism. And in this movie, the main character is not a victim of anything except his own victim mentality. He truly has created a paradigm in his head where he is constantly fighting this valorized struggle against a shadow that doesn't exist, an oppressive government crushing down on the small town of Eddington that he has to protect. But he is that oppressive governmental agent. And his actions throughout the film, they made me think about the way media like Stranger Things has made me deeply sympathize with characters like Jim Hopper. In season 1 of Stranger Things, Jim Hopper is this likable, lovable, dickhead rogue who you were like, oh, well, he might be a shitty cop, but he also has a heart of gold. And then every season after that makes you go, oh man, this guy fucking sucks. But it doesn't really seem like the Duffer Brothers as writers and like the creative team of the show fully understand the problem with Hopper's behavior throughout at least season 2 and beyond. Whereas this movie seems almost like an active reaction to that element. Sticking with the Vonnegut train for a moment, in Slaughterhouse-Five, I think about in the opening chapter, Vonnegut is talking to Bernard V. O'Hare, who incidentally is also a character in Mother Night, who in Slaughterhouse-Five he's posed as Vonnegut's old war buddy. In Mother Night he's posed as the American soldier who apprehended Campbell, the propagandist. And in the opening chapter to Slaughterhouse-Five, he's talking to O'Hare's wife, and she confronts him and says, oh, your story that you're writing, your war book you're writing about World War II, you're going to like make war look glamorous. You're going to make the struggle look glamorous when really it's just a bunch of children playing dress up, and it's going to be made into a movie starring John Wayne or Frank Sinatra or another one of those dirty war-loving old men. And Vonnegut raises his hand and he says to Mary, Mary, I promise you, when I write my war book, there will be no room for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne in it. And this movie made me really think about that John Wayne archetype and how it has infected American pop culture over the years. And this goes back to me saying that, in my opinion, this movie is Aster saying, well, I'm going to make Blazing Saddles today. It's a story about racial injustice. It's a story about prejudice exercised through institutional power. And this is told through the lens of a highly elevated Western spoof. But like I said, it's a satire, and it's a comedy in the most technical sense. But the comedy of it is fueled very intensely and very heavily by the idea that these are deeply uncomfortable things to laugh at and to joke about. And the movie seems almost to be a commentary on its own existence in a way that reminds me it reminds me a lot of Ralph Bakshi's, some of his work in like the Coonskin and like Heavy Traffic era, where he's engaging with a lot of complicated questions. And once again, he's engaging with those complicated questions in a way that acknowledges the struggle of demographics that are not his own, and his sort of gaze on those social issues from the perspective of an assimilated Jewish European immigrant. And this movie really felt like Aster doing something sort of similar. And I think your feelings on the film, and where I feel like I'm going to have to watch this movie 2 or 3 more times to figure out how I feel about it. But immediately at this point, like those Bakshi films, I think your take and feelings on Eddington, if you decide to engage with this piece of media, are largely going to be dependent on your feelings about whether this was Aster's A, story to tell, and B, if it was his story to tell, if you are interested in hearing what Ari Aster has to say about these things. Because I think the movie is not always super effective at conveying its themes. The pacing is, I think, a lot messier than his previous movies. Like, Beau is Afraid was a very long movie, but I thought it had, like, razor-tight pacing. Midsommar I just rewatched this week, kind of in anticipation of watching Eddington. And once again, I thought the pacing was excellent. In this movie, the pacing, well, at times it really does have the experience, replicate the experience of just scrolling a social media feed. And I actually missed the film's very opening instant because there was an ad. They decided right before the movie started to play an ad for Jeep. And I was like, well, I'm going to go piss one more time right now while the ad's playing. When I got back, I realized I didn't even know for sure if the ad for Jeep had been an ad for Jeep or if that had been the opening frame of the movie. And I don't think it was. But there were a couple points at the during the movie after that really made me question whether it had just opened with an advertisement for a vehicle. Because much like Beau is Afraid, this movie is very interested in delving into the way that contemporary capitalist conditions shape economic conditions, which shape interactions in municipal environments. And in Beau is Afraid, that's largely happening within the framework of the medical industrial complex, the psychiatric industrial complex, how those things are tied in with the drug industry, the entertainment industry, and sort of corporate America as a whole. And in this movie, those things are really sort of happening through the dichotomy between the policy sector of government and the enforcement sector of government. And the movie is kicked off by a conflict, a border conflict between a sheriff who doesn't want to wear a mask and obey the COVID mask mandate, and the cops in the neighboring township who are like, you're on our border, you need to wear a mask. And he goes back into his own hometown and he decides he's sick of it and he's going to run for mayor. And it leads to his life disintegrating and it leads to the whole community disintegrating. And, going back to the idea of, is this Aster's story to tell? Because this movie is very much so set against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 and those conditions. But at the same time, I really feel like Aster's project wasn't to speak to those social movements directly, but to look at the way that those social movements did ripple through areas that are predominantly white America and like small town white America in this case. And Eddington is more diverse than just that, but at the same time, it's a very idealized version of diversity. Much like in Blazing Saddles, there is a major character in the movie who is a black man who is also a member of the police. And so even as the movie is sort of skewering these power systems, you sort of have the main avatar of that oppression still be acting from within the framework of that oppression. It's, Zootopia syndrome. And this was a really weird movie to watch directly in the wake of Sinners, which was very much so this like empowerment fantasy. And, I was listening to a podcast recently. It was an episode of the Bechdel Cast, which is a film podcast where the hosts use the Bechdel test as a jumping off point to talk about different movies. And they were talking about Get Out, and they had a guest on to talk about Get Out. And one of the things they talked about in regards to Get Out is the idea that the original ending was very nihilistic and would have ended with Chris going to prison for the murder of Rose and her family, and nobody would believe him. And that ending was changed because test audiences had a negative reaction to it. They wanted to see Chris survive. And in this story, that character, Michael, who is a police officer who's caught within this sort of system. He's tokenized by both sides of that political spectrum, the policy side and the enforcement side. And spoilers, I mean, there's been spoilers alluded to here and there throughout the review, but I thought that they had killed him off at one point in the movie, and I was really upset by that, and had felt that it was cowardly, because I do think Aster had a right to tell this story. I think Aster had a right to tell the story of how, as a white man in America, he has witnessed these things that have fundamentally shaped our cultural and political conditions over the last few years. However, I think it would have been irresponsible if he had made the only major focused on black body in his film disposable in the course of doing that. In Lindsay Ellis's video on Mel Brooks and the ethics of satire about Nazis, she talks about how Brooks said he was willing to show the mechanics of racism in action, but he would never show a lynching on screen because that would be like him out of his lane. And I do think that there are going to be elements of this film that Aster is criticized for, and probably rightly so. But at the same time, I feel like a movie like this doesn't really get released into the world unless the people behind it are ready to have that conversation and accept that criticism. So I'm really excited to see what writers and analysts and people from different economic class and cultural backgrounds have to say about this movie. I'm really excited to see that content coming out from other creators and writers and reviewers, critics. And like I said, this video has really been my attempt to at least process those immediate thoughts for myself. And I guess where I've really come away from it, what I really come away from it all feeling like, is that I don't know that this movie successfully balanced all of its themes, but approaching it for me as a writer, I know that I have not, in my writing, looked honestly at the COVID-19 pandemic and the trauma that it inflicted on us as a culture. There's this idea in like social discourse around 9/11 that the trauma of 9/11 turned us into a nation of children. And I think something kind of very similar happened with COVID, where it really did cause us to experience this kind of broad social regression. And tying that back into what I was saying about Vonnegut earlier, and you know, the subtitle of Slaughterhouse-Five is "Or the Children's Crusade, or A Duty Dance with Death," which is to say that every war, be it a war fought on the battlefield in a declared fashion, or whether it is class war fought from within on city streets between people who have and people who have not, what's going to be built in whose backyard, and who gets to sleep in what park, and who gets to sleep in what apartment. All of those things are the result of both policy and enforcement. And both of those sectors have been in a state of extremely high tension since the pandemic hit. And I haven't wanted to touch any of that in my writing. Everything I've written since 2021 narratively has just happened post-pandemic. And this movie, I guess, really made me think about whether or not I feel like Aster successfully got across everything he was trying to say in this movie. And by extension, everyone else who made the film. Because I don't really subscribe to auteur theory. I do view the writer as the narrative guide of a film, but they really are collaborative processes, and that needs to be acknowledged. So the creators and storytellers behind this film, I feel very strongly that I don't know how I feel about what they said, but they said something that I myself haven't really had the guts to say to myself as a writer. And I'm going to think a lot more about the film and about the text but that at least made me think enough to want to film this video and comment on everything that I've commented on. And so that was my thoughts, off the cuff, unedited, raw, unfiltered, on the 2025 A24 joint, Eddington. So before I go, I am going to go ahead and I am going to plug this anthology, We Can Always Tell, from Laughing Man House Press. This is a new anthology, came out a couple months ago, which features erotic trans horror stories, if that is your bag. A bunch of new stories from trans creators covering all sorts of aspects of anxiety around bodies and body horror and sex and transformation. And that's not really super applicable to Eddington specifically as a text, but I feel like is applicable to Aster's wider oeuvre. And if I'm going to start filming these videos, I feel like I'm also going to start plugging the writing projects that I have going on at any given time at the end of these videos in lieu of a sponsorship. Because as a freelance writer, and as a writer who is now making this content with the intent of engaging as a writer with other writers' work and other creatives' work, and engaging in that cultural conversation in a more unstructured format in addition to my actual writing, I figure I'm going to use that platform to promote the work of other writers that I get to work with as I continue to have my stories published. And so my short story juice is in this book, but more than that, there are a couple dozen cracking tales in here you should take a peep at. And beyond that, this is a film I might return to in a future video. I might just do some more videos on my thoughts on Aster's broader filmography as a whole in the future. But if you have followed me on this journey this far, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. And I would love if you watched this if you sounded off in the comments, and if you let me know what you thought of this film, because I would certainly love to know what the other 5 people, including the 2 who walked out partway through the film during my showing, thought of this movie, and I never will. I have been Officer V.F. Thompson, Feywild, and that's the way the news goes.